Welcome everybody to today's community conversation. This is the wrap up of 2022 with the Dynamo Office Hours. Jacob Small. Want to welcome everybody. Well, God, Jacob, it's been a fun year. It's been a roller coaster. We got some exciting things on tap for 2023. Including the AEC roadmap, and I saw Jacob and Saul's name on that in January. And we need to get some Dynamo community conversations or the office hours on the calendar for 2023. Some big format changes and some awesome things that'll be running a lot smoother. So I'm excited about that.
Cool.
Let's just get into it. All right, community conversations, for those who don't know, they're just they are virtual meetups featuring expert speakers from across the community. They feature lots of different things. There's panels, there's product live demos, there's tips and tricks. We're going to do some solution panels that was suggested a while ago in 2023. And I know Jacob threw up his hand and volunteered. So we'll definitely bring him in and have some fun and abuse him. Industry panels, you can submit your own if you go to the community conversations page and click the get involved. There's a form there, as well as a whole bunch of information about what community conversations are. All right, let's go to my favorite, Jacob. And I also found a way I can run the slides as well on your machine during a Zoom. We can do that in 2023. That way I don't have to go ding or next.
Okay.
Safe harbor statement. This just simply says that if we say anything or talk about features of products, that you only make purchasing decisions based on the products as they are today. That's it. Pretty simple when you boil it all down. So we can't make any promises for the future, but anyway, that's it in a nutshell. All right, let's get going. I'm Sean Hurley, Autodesk Community Engagement Manager. I am a geeky technologist in I was going to say sunny, snowy Bend, Oregon.
And I am Jacob Small. I am a technical consultant focusing on generative design and BIM. Describe myself as a Dynamo form junkie. I'm on there all the time, based out of Boston, Mass, but currently in Stockholm, Sweden. Not with us today is Sol Moore, the product manager for Dynamo. He describes himself as a curious human being. He's actually out on paternity. He's welcomed another wonderful little bundle of joy in for the holiday season, and really happy for him and excited to get to meet his growing family when everybody's back from vaccinations and everything that has to happen with little kids. So,
at least in Vegas, right?
Yeah, that's true. It's true. All right. So before we begin, I'll cover this bit. Everyone's line's been muted kind of to start with to reduce the background noise, make sure we have a good recording. That said, this session is going to be much more laid back. We've got a lot less of the standard, like, here's all the things we want to throw at you in terms of presentation to make sure we've got that educational content out there and sort of the demo stuff. So we'll keep it a lot more open. Go ahead and raise your hand, ask stuff in the Q&A. Feel free to say, hey, I'd like to ask my question live. The session will be recorded, so a link to the recording will be emailed out to all our registrants and posted to the community conversations page. By participating in the session, you consent to being recorded and posted online to live forever and ever up on YouTube. So that's that. All right, so on to the next one. This is our year in review. So we're going to start by sort of presenting kind of what we've done over the last year's worth of presentations, talk about what's happening going forward. I do have plans to try and do a live build with nothing to start from in terms of decorating a holiday tree, which I thought might be kind of fun and maybe fit the season a little bit. And while we're at it, we're going to get into answering as many of your questions as possible. So without further ado, let's talk about what we talked about before on Dynamo Office Hours. And it is a pretty big list for this year. So we started off by talking about how Dynamo integrates into our different hosts. There's two different methods. There's the in-process method, where basically Dynamo is sort of run on top of our host application. That would be your Revits, your Civil 3Ds, your advanced steels. And that does mean that Dynamo can't really do any work when your application's doing something. Your application can't really do any work when Dynamo is doing something. So that's something to keep in mind. There's also out-of-process integrations, and where Dynamo sort of lives outside the host's primary application. Some benefits to that, if let's say your host crashes, right? We've all crashed Revit before or Civil 3D before. The good news is Dynamo doesn't crash, and vice versa, which makes things a little bit stabler, faster in some instances. Our out-of-process applications are pretty much format, alias, robot as sort of the primary ones. The other thing that we went over is the mechanics of moving data between things. It winds up that 99% of your design tasks are pretty much just a different way of referring to the same context. So there's a few different ways that we move that content over. We can be marshalling data, sort of taking data from one application into the other. This takes some time. It is intended that the data from one application is the exact same as the data in the other application. All sorts of translation stuff that has to happen. So if I'm saying, hey, I am this Revit element, or in this case, hey, I'm Jacob, or hey, Jagheter Jacob. All of that content basically is saying the exact same thing, just in a different language. And it's really important that we keep that stuff as accurate as possible. And so some of the reasons why it's a little bit slow to move from, let's say, a Revit object into a Dynamo object, the reason for that is because it takes time to sort of translate stuff over. So only serialize or marshal the data that you really need to move across. The next session that we had was building with Dynamo. This is where we started to talk about how Dynamo integrates with Revit. So this was all about talking to Revit from Dynamo. First thing that we went over was elements in Revit, and probably the biggest takeaway from this session. Again, just about everything in Revit is an element. There are a few exceptions, but they're pretty few and far between. Generally speaking, if it's something that I can touch, if it's something that I can see, even your project browser, believe it or not, is an element in your Revit database. You know, whether you're looking at a selected model element that returns element, or a selected model element that returns wall, which happens to also be the category, or floor, those are all, again, elements. The other thing that we talked about in that session, and similar in our next session, was mapping out your process. If you ever sit down to automate something and you don't know what all those steps that you want to automate are, you're probably not going to automate it very effectively. You might get there, but not as effectively as if you sort of had that map. So we talked about building a map, talking about, you know, hey, if I wanted to automate all the structural framing that we see here, we'd probably first select the mask that we want to automate the framing for, identify sort of the primary drivers of those framing members, so that we can locate the columns based on the end of the framing, locate all the purlins based on evenly spacing them through the framing, locate all the joists, all the content basically generated. And if I understand what elements are driving the subsequent elements down the line, we can really start to get a lot of content done very, very quickly. After that, we got into getting civil with Dynamo, where we started to talk about the integration between Civil 3D and Dynamo. In particular, we looked at the different specific types of objects, and different constructors in the context of Civil 3D have different constructors and different things that we can do with them. So it's really important to have a good understanding of what is available in our library. So as we got less specific data types, so in this case we had object, we had a very sort of generic constructor. Might work for some things, might not work for all of them. If we need a very particular type of thing, we probably want to get into our particular types of constructors. So on the left side of the images here, we had our less specific object, where we have an object by geometry node, but very specific, we have a block reference, and we can place block references by coordinate systems, or just by create, which I believe takes a XYZ location as a point. Can't quite remember on that, but generally generic types work on sort of generic subtypes, negating the need for sort of that arc.geometry or line.geometry, et cetera, et cetera. So leverage your generic to sort of pull information from, but try to focus on the specific data types when you're trying to create things. That's my general advice there. We also talked about, apparently my screen lost its focus. There we go. We also talked about playing with all the toys. It's not just Dynamo that you have access to, right? In particular, in the context of Civil 3D, and we didn't show this here, there's that command that you can send to the command line through the Civil 3D AutoCAD command line prompt, AEC run Dynamo script, and then the path to the script you're trying to run, which is super useful, super cool. You can do a ton of amazing automations by just sending that command to Dynamo or to AutoCAD and having that kick off from outside Civil 3D actually, which is pretty cool. But we did talk about quite a bit about Dynamo Player, which is a great way to sort of access a headless version of Dynamo that'll sort of kick up and allow you to adjust those inputs. It's a little bit more user-friendly. Generally speaking, Dynamo Player, be it in the context of Civil 3D or in the context of Revit, we want to try and get everybody in the office to use that, while we have a smaller subset of users trying to do the authoring of or editing of graphs, and a smaller subset of the smaller subset doing the initial authoring. We also talked about generative design, which, while not officially supported in the context of Civil 3D, can be made to work with a little bit of tweaking. You basically just have to enable the package inside your Dynamo for Civil context, and then you're off to the races, which is pretty cool. From there, we talked about host of the Dynamo party in our next session. First things that we talked about there were advanced steel robot. We also talked about Formit, which is perhaps my favorite integration because it's all about conceptual and just geometry manipulation, which is pretty cool, as well as Alias, which is probably the most complex geometrically. If I ever see somebody ask a Dynamo for Alias question on the Dynamo form, I'm like, okay, this is going to be a big one. Let me pull out the calculator before we get started. But yeah, you can do a lot of really amazing stuff. And because it's all Dynamo under the hood in each of these interactions, the graph that you write in application A can very easily facilitate transfer of data to application B. So if you wanted to, I don't know, take the level of surfacing, detailing, and authoring capability that you might have for building a car in Alias and leverage computational design in there, the output of that can also be used to facilitate a really unique and very accurate layout for a facade element or a screen element or an interior feature, exterior feature. Form making becomes really, really amazing in that context. From there, we went back into the Revit world to talk about building more with Dynamo, got over some more advanced topics to facilitate some more advanced workflows. In particular, the key, probably the biggest takeaway here, the thing I refer people to the most in this one was actually staying up to date. When do things in Dynamo update? Some nodes are going to update kind of all the time, right? So they're going to, any change in the graph means that node's going to go ahead and update. You want to be real careful with this because it can create those infinite loops that lock everybody up and sort of keep you locked up now and forever. So be real careful with that. Otherwise, you're going to be hearing the danger music that nobody ever likes to hear. To find out in particular which nodes those are, because this is an ever-changing list. We gave you some of them here, but that's by no means going to be complete because Dynamo is always under development. You can always go to the GitHub, Dynamo DS, Dynamo Revit, and then search for Revit Services Updater, and you should get a list of anything that updates kind of automatically. There you go. After that, we went into advanced topics for civil. In particular, probably the biggest piece here to kind of get to know was understanding blocks, which are a little bit unique to AutoCAD in comparison to Revit anyways, in that everything in Civil 3D and AutoCAD is a block. Model space, hey, that's actually a block. Your paper space, that's actually a block. The blocks that you're placing, well, yes, those are blocks too, so on and so forth. So understanding what those are can really sort of help you navigate that much more readily. After that, we had a session on the Dynamo and Revit API, talked about how to sort of expand on the capabilities that you get with Dynamo. What are the new things we can do? What are some of the limitations and stuff like that? So we talked about how to translate Revit API calls into actual Python. Is probably the most common piece. We see C# code written all over the place, and we can do a lot of really useful stuff with it once we understand how to translate it into Python so we can quickly kind of iterate it. So we did cover that in pretty good detail. After that, we had a similar session for Civil 3D. You might be picking up on a bit of a trend with a Revit, Civil, everything else, Revit, Civil, everything else. Anybody wants to guess at what comes next in the chat, feel free. But Civil 3D API is very different from the Revit API. So Revit API, it tends to be everything's more or less under Revit DB or Revit.db.architecture. And AutoCAD API, it's all over the place. So you have a little bit more of a difficult time to sort of find the perfect thing that you're after. Great point, David. It is everything else, but not quite. All right, so from our database, we get our tables. Our tables include our layer table, our dimension style table, other style tables as well. In particular, the block table, which again is where everything is stored for all our model geometry. That block table has its block table record, and that block table record is the actual lines of items that are stored inside the database. So if you want to add something to an AutoCAD document, you actually have to add it into the block table record, which means you have to first pull that block table. So that's why when you look at the boilerplate template for Python for Civil 3D, there's a lot more lines in it than what you get with Revit. After that, it was format. You were pretty close, David. We'll give you points anyway. So first thing that we talked about, or probably the biggest piece with format compared to the others, is there's different types of graphs. In particular, my favorite is the geometry graph. There's also data graphs where if you just wanted to sort of get some information, like how many square feet of something do I have, you can use Dynamo to sort of pull that very quickly, where Format might not be able to sort of report that directly. But there's also our geometry creation graphs, which are my favorite type of the Format graphs. Basically, when you run it, you're going to send something into Format to create a new solid or surface or whatever have you, which is pretty cool. After that, we got into Alias, where we talked about all sorts of the amazing stuff that can happen with Alias. Talked a little bit about the pattern toolkit, which is a lot of fun, but in particular, probably the piece to hit on the most, because it has the most potential, in my opinion, is the capability to work with T-spline models and get some really elaborate and complex geometry over into Dynamo, into Alias, back and forth with a lot more sort of ease of use. From there, we got into robot structural analysis. The key piece here, this is the highlight of the slide, is actually installation for me, because it can be a little bit difficult to get up and running. But once you do, it opens up a whole new realm of possibilities in terms of what we can do for our analysis and sort of automating and ensuring that we've got the right content sort of stood up within the installations for robot structural analysis. And then after that, having covered all of our integrations at once or twice, we finally got into our visual refresh. So Dynamo 2.13, which came out with our 2022 product launch, did include a whole new look and feel. So you can see our tabs are different. We've got a new file state indicator, active tab indicator, custom node icon. Sol and I took a lot of time to make sure we caught every change we could think of and find between the two different Dynamo setups. So if you're curious where something went, definitely go back and check out the presentation there so that we can go back and sort of see what's new, what's different. It's not just that the nodes are a different color. Yes, they are, but it's a whole bunch more stuff, and you can really get to that content. Then we finally got to generative design. And I put here that we're in the end game now. Ha ha ha, right? The quote from Avengers there. But yeah, there is a lot that led up to this, right? And when we originally started with this 2.5 years ago, actually, it first brought to me, it was like, hey, could you do a thing on generative design? It was like, yes, but we've got some stuff we got to cover first. And it took 2.5 years, but we got through it all. And we started to actually get to generative design. So we talked a little bit about kind of what's new, what's happening, what sort of stuff you can do with it, which was pretty cool. And then we had John Pearson sort of produce or present on kind of how you can take an existing graph and turn it into a generative graph, which is a great way to get started with generative. From there, Lily came in and we started talking about sort of how we can author these tools from scratch, as opposed to manipulating an existing graph and turning it into something generative. What would it be if we were sort of starting from zero? And Lily brought us through this great example, talking about how we sort of start with people, we introduce a little bit more computer, and then go to even more people, which is pretty cool. She also, this is an example in the second session that Lily hosted for us to talk about sort of the view analysis and how do we sort of decide what a good design is. And really that's the bulk of where our generative design efforts fall. It's actually pretty easy to sort of automate creation of these things once you know what it is that you're after and you've covered those other sessions. The hard part is really identifying what is good design, right? What makes for a good office? What makes for a good residence, right? Those answers are so varied. And if I've tried this out before, gone into an office and pulled 15 different designers and said, hey, we're here to talk about automating or optimizing office design. Can you tell me what makes a good office? And I got 10 completely different answers, right? And you write those down and try and find what really matters. But the interesting thing about it is it's not just what matters to you or the firm, but also to the customer. So those graphs that you write for day one might not work on graph two. Anyway, after that, we had parametric pumpkins with Zach Cron. This was a blast. I always loved doing pumpkins with Zach. I looked forward so much to his blog posts back in the day, back before I even used Revit to really sort of date myself. Or maybe I'm dating Zach there, I don't know. But yeah, they were, this session was a lot of fun. Zach taught us a few cool things like geometry color by surface color, does not put any shadows. That's how we got that great sort of glow through the pumpkin here, which is handy thing. I knew it, but I'd never thought of using it that way. So definitely put that in my back pocket for later. And then finally, generative design from scratch, right? We went through the process of creating some generative design workflows for placing 2 cabins on a wooded lot. We generated a completely random lot. I had never run that graph before, and then randomly placed the cabins on the surface and then allowed generative design to try and find that optimal location so that the cabins were as far apart from each other on site as possible, still in the constraints of the site and missing as many trees as possible. We got some pretty interesting results from that optimization, which was pretty cool. All right, so what's next? Before we get there, I wanted to have one more brief reminder, a word from our lawyers. We've seen this a few times. Again, it's really important that we take everything that I'm about to say and this kind of stuff with a grain of sand, because I don't know. I'm going to try and look into the crystal ball and sort of figure out what I can, but don't use this to make any investment or purchasing decisions. The way I like to think of it, this is one of my favorite haikus on this topic. Is it a shooting star falling? Maybe a plane? Maybe Superman? Let's not just buy on what Jacob thinks that might be. All right. So without further ado, what do we think's next? So some key things that I think are next. We're going to see a lot new product updates and feature updates. So as more new interesting things come into products, we're going to see more and more ways to automate them. We're also going to see some great work from the Dynamo community. We always see great work from the Dynamo community. Maybe this doesn't need to be said, but as those new features are released, we're going to find people doing things we never thought possible. I think back to the creation of in Revit 2020, where we had the path of travel nodes came out. Our path of travel tool came out in Revit, right? And it was like, oh, great, I can click and then I can click. But the number of clicks, it's really sort of frustrating to get all that content out there. So what can we do to kind of get that stuff through faster? Well, let's make some nodes to find the path of travel from any point in the room to all my egress points to find the shortest and the longest so I know if I'm code compliant. People were doing amazing stuff about 15 minutes after we let that out into the world, and that was great. So I'm looking forward to seeing what we get there with those new features. We're also going to see new ways to use Dynamo. We've already started to see a lot of people look at what would happen if I could send commands from one application into another and have Dynamo kick off. I talked earlier about that idea of sending a command to Civil 3D and have it instantly pick up on running a Dynamo script. Right now, I can't modify that Dynamo script. I have to do it before I send it, but you can do some really powerful stuff that way. I also think we're going to see a lot more and better cloud interactions. We've seen some people start to get content on that stuff moving back and forth, pull stuff from Forge to Forge, etc. I think we're going to see a lot more of that as we continue to scale up into ACC and look at ways where we can collaborate. Sean, I do see your haikus. These are great. I'll go ahead and read them out. Actually, why don't you present them for us, since it's your work of art there?
Just the one. It's digital wizardry, powering design and creation. Dynamo, oh Dynamo.
I love it.
The other is Jacob, master of code, weaving digital magic with Dynamo's power.
That's great. Yeah, it's all Dynamo. I'm just a guy in the background that leverages it, but those are some great ones. So before, or actually while I start to look at generating a little holiday tree here for us, anybody want to speak up on things that they'd like to see come up in the next year, or things they think might happen within code, or new technology that they think could be a lot of fun?
And Jacob, would you be interested in like maybe some topics for the next in the series?
Absolutely, absolutely. No pressure or anything, guys. All right, while that's while people are thinking of what sort of stuff they might like to see, again, feel free to put it in chat or raise your hand. We can take you off mute, or I think you might be able to actually unmute yourself. I am spinning up Dynamo in the background. And once we get into it, I will go ahead and start doing, here it goes. We'll build a little holiday tree. All right, so first thing that I need is if I'm going to be doing this, I need a way to sort of define my tree. And we're going to keep it really simple. I could get really elaborate and do some branches if I had some more time, but looking at a clock where I got about 15, maybe 20 minutes to go through here, and I want to be interacting with you guys at the same time, we're going to go ahead and we're going to start with our geometry. And then I'm going to look at my solids, and there's this cone node. And so we can build cones a few different ways. We're going to just use by point and radius. So this has a start point, which is the base of my cone, and an end point. So we're going to lift our start point up just a little bit, point by coordinates X, Y, and Z. And we're going to bring it up just a foot above our grade plane. We'll leave the X and Y at 0. Great comment. I'd love to see more civil stuff. A lot of drainage analysis. Would love to take data to and from Excel. So that's interesting to hear you say that. I'm actually working with a couple colleagues or a couple customers to do sort of similar content in terms of sort of scaling stuff up to be able to move stuff back and forth. There's actually ways you can do a lot of that already right now, which is pretty cool. So yeah, I think we're going to start to see that become more and more commonplace, but somebody has to sort of pioneer it first before we really get to see it out there. And I'm hoping that's what we're going to start to see on that piece. So great point. And Adam, if I can integrate that into a coming community conversation, I'll see what I can do. All right, so then we've got our second point that I've placed up here. I'm going to make my tree 9 feet tall in total. We're just assume we have 10 feet in there. Whoop. And then I'm going to set that for my endpoint. And now I have a tree that's a little bit better, but my radius isn't quite great. I'm going to use a number slider to adjust the base of my tree. And so we'll wire that into my start radius. Minimum 1, maximum, I don't know, 5, step of 0.5. That should give me enough for shape. And that's starting to look pretty good. I do want a trunk, so I'm going to do a cylinder by height radius, coordinate system height radius. Conveniently, it's at the right height already, but just in case, we'll go ahead and we'll wire this same number that I wrote here. That way, if I change the height of the piece, it will stay the right height. And then we need a radius. Let's set that at, let's actually take our number slider and divide it by 5. So 2.5 divided by 5 gives us our radius, and then we'll go ahead and wire that in. And now that's looking like a pretty good cartoon Christmas tree. I don't want to see these points, so we'll go ahead and hide that geometry, but I do want to see these for now. All right, so the next piece, if we want to start decorating this, we need to be able to start putting some, maybe some baubles on there, right? So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take my cone and use a geometry.explode. This is going to break my solid down, or whatever geometry I have, into its component parts. So instead of having one cone, I'm going to have 2 surfaces. We'll go ahead and hide that. I'm also going to hide this to identify which of those surfaces it is that I want to work with. So I'm going to pull out first the surface at index 0, and that's the good one. If I grab the wrong one, if I guessed index 1, we would have seen just that. All right, so that would be the bottom of my tree, and that's not what we want to work with. We want to work with all of that. So from here, I can start to define some points at each one of those parameters. Math dot, actually, let's do it this way. We'll do a range from 0 to 1, 10 times for our U. You can see that'll allow me to sort of scale stuff up along one side. And if I did it this way, that allows us to sort of work its way around. If I do it both, we get a happy little spiral. And we're going to be using that in a minute here when it comes time to placing some other decorations. But for now, I'm going to just use math.randomList. And I'm going to place 30. And I picked 30 because I remember back as a kid, we had a collection of these that we put on the tree that came in at, whoop, didn't mean to copy both, came in a box of 5 by 6. And it was always a pain to put back up into the attic, but it was a lot of fun. All right, so that's looking pretty good, but I don't really love the dispersion. So we'll go ahead and add a trigger to this to just make new versions thereof. So the way I do that, test n, otherwise n. And then I can add a Boolean node here. So what I did was I wrote a true false statement. This is my test. If it's true, it's going to return in. If it's false, it's going to return in. And so now I can wire both of these into that and into that. And so now anytime I want to grab a new number, we just click the value. And that'll give us a new layout, which is pretty cool. All right. If we wanted to scale up and make more, we could up this to 60. Or we could cut it back to 20. And again, each time I toggle this, I'll get a new result. Let's leave it up at 60 for now. So we'll have 2 of those annoying boxes, but it does get a little bit dense at the top. So let's try and remap range. This is going to take all of those numbers and remap them between my new minimum of 0 and our new maximum of 0.9. Let's have a look at how this looks. And we're going to need to do that for both of these. So I'm going to go ahead and highlight those 2 nodes I want to copy it up, wire our other list in and over there. It's a little bit better. And I feel like we could continue to play with this a few times and get something that looks pretty good from a few different angles. But the problem is we're just making points. We want to make actual ornaments, right? Okay, so let's make a sphere by center point radius. And I'm going to just make it at the origin. And we need to just adjust our radius. Let's set this to 0.125. And I can't see it unless I change to that angle, but that looks pretty good. But I've got these points and I've got a sphere. So we got to figure out how to put these into position. Instead of doing point at parameter, we use a coordinate system at parameter. There's our surface again. There's our remapped views, remapped V's, and then we get all those funny looking pieces. I can go ahead and hide this geometry now and then use a geometry.transform to take any geometry like my sphere and any coordinate systems like that and suddenly start to populate my tree, which is pretty cool. All right, now let's start to get into colors. What are we doing for time? I'm doing pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and hide all of this geometry. And then we're going to use a geometry color by geometry color node. We'll wire our geometry in, and then let's get some range of colors here. There's a few different ways I could do that. One node that I really like under Refinery Toolkit, I think it's under Explore Contrasty Color Range. is we could make, I don't know, a list of 19, 19, 19, 19. Flatten that list. And what this does is it just makes really high contrast colors. So when I wire that in, I suddenly have random, fairly high contrast colors that have been sprinkled about my tree. I could go ahead and shuffle them, make new layouts as many times as I might like, which is pretty cool. That doesn't look too bad. But that some of these might not look too great up against whatever color I pick for my tree. So let's actually do this a little bit different. I'm going to use a list.chop node, and we're going to chop this into lengths of 5. And then I'm going to build a color range. This requires some colors as an input. So we'll take our color palette. Anybody got a favorite color they'd like me to pick? Feel free to speak up, put it in the chat. I'm going to start with this fuchsia. We'll copy a second one, and then I'm going to put a blue, orange. Okay. We got an orange coming up next.
Way to bring in Tennessee colors, Danya. How about green? I mean, that's a traditional.
Green, okay. Which green do you like, Sean? How about this one?
Sure, yeah.
Cool.
Better,
all right.
Better than lime.
Better than lime, yeah. All right, so we'll start with this set of 4. And I'm going to take these, I'm going to use this little handy highlight here. That's part of the monocle view extension from the wonderful John Pearson. We can use this little shopping cart icon that pulls up after I hover over the widget there to instantly create a list of colors, right? And this is what our blend kind of looks like now. And now I can say, okay, what indices are these placed at? This needs to be to be spaced between 0 and 1. So if I start a list and say 0, 0.25, 0.3, and 1, and wire this in, watch what happens with that. We just sort of shift everything to the left. If you leave this out, it's going to be evenly distributed. But it does allow you to sort of weight colors one direction or another, which can be really useful if you're using this for generative design, to sort of say, hey, anything under, let's say 20%, we know we're totally good with. Anything as we start to get over 20% to 30%, it's close. After 30%, we're like way out of bounds. So you can start to alter the way that sort of changes, maybe do something like 0.35. right? And it really starts to change, right? So for now, we're going to leave it like this. And then we've got a list of values to pick up. We're going to start a range from 0, end at 1, and then use list.count. And we're going to count how many chopped up lists we have. Right? I forgot a number sign there. Right, so now I've got 12 possible values that are starting at 0, ending at 1, all the way through. Those become my values there. And the net colors that are returned are sort of mapped from 0% to 1% based on what those values are. So we can hide this value and wire this in. And now we've got sort of consistent colors, right? That same blue is being reused consistently. Based on our selection. So if I come in and I change this fuchsia to maybe a deeper purple, we're going to get different results, which is pretty cool. All right, I liked the fuchsia best, so we're going back to that. This is my graph, so I get to have some fun with my tree, right, Sean? All right, so that's our first step. The next step that I said we were going to take a look at is sort of playing with that spiral pattern down the outside of the tree. So we're going to go ahead and actually, before we get there, let's do a geometry color by geometry color for our cylinder. palettes. Let's pick a nice woodish brown. And we'll hide this. And then I also want to display my tree. Christmas tree green, close enough. We'll turn off this, and there we go. All right, so now the next piece is starting to wrap some tinsel from top down. So we're going to use those. What's the node I'm looking for? ISO curve by parameter line on surface. This takes a base surface. I've got one of those. Start parameters and end parameters. So I'm going to start from 0 to 1 10 times. And end parameters, we're going to use a list.drop items. We're going to just drop the last item in this list. We can do that by using a -1 instead of a +1. So instead of ending at 1 like we did here, we're going to end at 0.88. Those will be our start parameters. And I also need to come up with the first point for all of these. So taking the same piece, and instead we're going to drop just 1. So right off the front of the list. So instead of starting at 0, we're going to start at 0.11. Here's our end parameters. And what are we getting here? UV, UV, we didn't get the right values. So these are individual values. We need to make UV by coordinates from those. So here we go. Instead of using U's, we're going to send UVs, and suddenly I have something that is allowing me to quickly march along the edges of the tree, which is pretty cool. All right. What if I change this to be, I don't know, over to 2? How are we working there? Well, it's getting a little bit higher, but it's going twice. So let's duplicate this, set that back to 1. And I can't remember if this maps U vertically. There we go. So now we've got 2 wraps around the tree. Let's try 4 wraps around the tree. That's looking pretty good. So now from here, we want to talk about what might we be able to do with this to sort of get something that's a little bit better looking. So right now it's sort of that list of curves. Let's make it a polycurve. And we'll hide this. And then I mentioned before, I really like the T-spline capability of alias and sort of what we can do with that. So let's see what we can do here. We can do a T-spline surface built from lines. So this takes a list of lines. Yeah, this might work for us. No vertices, no edges, so that didn't work. Let's try it with this one instead. No vertices, still not working. Pipes. List of curves. All right, maybe not quite the right scale. Let's look at what we have for stuff that we can control. Default radius 0.06125. A little bit better. Next piece, snapping tolerance, segment count, auto handle, start rotation to rotation, start precision. In smooth mode, hey, let's set that to true. And that's looking pretty good, end to end. Check the time, down to the last 10 minutes. So now, geometry color, whoop, switched back to node view. Not sure how I got there. Geometry color. Let's see what we can do with this. I'm going to make this bright red. No, that's fuchsia. Bright red. There we go. And there we go. These are all tools that you can use in context with your individual designs, right? Now, yeah, we could have modeled this different ways, but we wouldn't necessarily get the easy parametric sort of controls on there to sort of be able to adjust those values, right? So if instead of starting at ending at the base, we wanted to stop at just before the base, and let's pull that down. So maybe we could put something up at the top, 0.95. And hey, let's do 3 wraps around the tree, not 43, that would be bad. 3 wraps around the tree instead, right? It's sort of controlled chaos that we've sort of implemented there, while simultaneously giving us the flexibility to adjust different pieces, right? We can adjust sort of the display of the ornaments. We could even go so far as to say, hey, let's take a moment and say, if these points are too close to another ornament, let's go ahead and purge it out. Don't have time to do that since we're down to the last 10 minutes, but been keeping an eye on the chat. Don't see anything else other people want to see for next year. So Sol and I will meet and come up with what we've got from the input we have now. Make a forest of trees. That's a good thought. So I can't do, I can do this quick, I think. Transform math.random list 50 n times 200, maybe. There we go. I need a copy of those.
You might need danger music.
I might. By coordinates. There we go. There's our X, there's our Y. These are our coordinate systems. Now, before I color stuff, I need to grab it. So we're grabbing that, we're grabbing this, we're grabbing our tree. Usually I would recommend, annotating as you go. All right, and then handy monocle. Poof, there it is, our 4 geometries. Hide all geometry preview. These go into our transform. Does it crash? No, it doesn't, but it didn't quite work out right, because what I need to do is I need to use levels on this and keep it to level 1 so it passes it as a single thing. And it looks like it's actually running even though it's not saying it. So let's check our task manager. This may have been the one that broke me. Yeah, run started. We've officially pushed Dynamo to the limit in trying to make my Christmas tree all over the place. We'll let it run while we get into our wrap up. Yeah, memory usage is going through the roof. While we get into the wrap up. So we have nothing planned. I forgot to update this slide. Great. We have nothing planned yet in terms of our timeline. Got to wait for Sol to get back so that he and I can sort of strategize on timing and topics. And then we'll meet up with Sean as well to sort of set up another series and another great year of helping you guys grow as Dynamo users and get deeper into the functional world of computational design. All right, awesome. Sean, you want to take over from here while we wait for my computer to maybe not be locked up?
Wait for it to crash.
Yeah.
I need a big screen capture with that big Christmas tree on there before it crashes. But anyway, David asked for the graph on that. That'd be kind of fun. Been a great wrap up. I may put stubs, just assume the Dynamo Office Hours, same day of the month, same time, but I may put Dynamo Office Hours TBD, topics, and we can go and update those, but at least people can subscribe to those.
Sounds great.
So maybe in the next week. The other thing is we do have the AEC product roadmap, and there is a design automations session. And Jacob, you'll be in that, right? Am I correct in that?
Yes, I will. I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be a fun session.
Yeah. So you can also be a community conversation speaker. So if you have a panel or a topic, you can just submit. If you want more information about community conversations, if you just go to the community conversation page, and there's a get involved link, it will tell you everything about it and give a link back to this forum. Next slide, please. I shared a whole bunch of resources in the chat. I included a lot of the Dynamo ones. This recording will be in the Dynamo Office Hours playlist on YouTube, as well as on the event page, the Dynamo forums, the Dynamo BIM forums, the Dynamo blog, the Voices blog, which we've got John Pearson, one of our Dynamo friendlies, is one of the authors of. We have 41 customer community authors in there. So a lot of good information, including Danya, who's on this. Lots of good stuff. Community Journal is by the community team, so latest announcements and what have you. And boy, I can't wait until we kick back up in 2023. Lots of fun, great changes, lots of great content. Just if you ever feel like you got a topic you want us to hit, let me know or let Jacob know. And anxious to see Saul too. So yeah, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year indeed. So it did finish.
Oh,
I had to make a change. I had to set the lacing to longest. But here is our forest. I didn't set the coloring yet because that would entail going back and finding all those and replacing them. But there you have it, guys.
Nice. They got snow on them.
Yeah, they got snowed on a bit. Yeah.
Can you zoom and make that one larger there? I just want to get a nice picture of that. Then we'll get like a perspective view. That's like looking out your window right now. Well, actually, it'd be dark, but hey.
It's very dark here.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you, Jacob. Thank you, everybody who attended. Next slide, just to kind of give the link. Just make sure to join us for the roadmaps and keep an eye on the event page. New events will be going up on there. So thank you, everybody. Have a nice, safe holiday period.
Yeah. Bye all.